So I helped one of the dogs I work with get a Valentine's Day card.
Oh, very sweet. Was it actually written by the other dog, or is this like a metaphor for a dog left a gift for the other dog?
I mean, it would be great and a great story if the dog that was giving it in question actually wrote it. No, it was the pet parent that wrote it, but it was all due to my new role at work in terms of running the social media. It was the two dogs I've told you about. The one where the male dog will constantly try to mount the female dog, but then
Oh
they
my
spend
gosh, that's
time
funny.
playing with each other. Because what I did at one point was took a picture of them and posted it up, and the pet parent for the female dog, started responding on social media like, "Oh, is that dog X that's hanging out with my dog?" And I responded back, "Yeah, they spend a lot of time with each other, they're friends and all that stuff." And before I knew it, come Valentine's Day, apparently the pet parent for the female dog brought in a Valentine's Day card for the dog that mounts her dog constantly.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's that's kind of amazing. Like you hope those people become friends. Or like is if there's a romantic interest between them, this could be a movie.
Yeah, romantic comedy, puppy love or something like that. But
Yeah, Must Love Dogs was already taken, unfortunately. But
yeah, but I just found it funny too because since that Valentine's, it's weird. Like the female dog in question has started getting a little more confident in group and has also started barking for my attention more. And it seems like she's not hanging out with that other dog as much as she used to. I mean, she still will. I'll make it 100% clear, but it seems like she's like, okay, I'm kind of bored with you now. I'm going to go over and start playing with these other dogs now. I mean, it's just great seeing relationships like that happen, and I'm glad the female dog is doing that too because obviously she comes in and it's I believe a confidence issue on her part, which makes her seem weak, which made the male dog start doing what he did. So if she's starting to stand up for herself a little bit more now, I mean that can explain why she's not spending as much time with that male dog. But at least I got him a Valentine's card.
that's awesome. Just such a
Yeah,
such a fun story. Oh no, it's like the antics of working at a place like where you're working with dogs. It's been fun.
yeah, so many stories, and yeah, they're just dogs at the end of the day, but there are a lot of correlations between what they do and what us humans do because there a lot of the bad things that these dogs do, if you want to call it bad, are just rash decisions they make in the heat of the moment, and how many humans have done the same damn thing.
Yeah, like in kind of a fun transition, it kind of goes the same for me for toddlers and like small children. It's like, okay, but have you seen how you act when you feel like somebody merged too close in front of you? Like, are you really emotionally intelligent enough to judge my 3-year old on yeah, like I still always love this perspective when I read about it for parenting of just that, okay, yes, them not getting the candy or them not having their stuffy doesn't feel like the end of the world to you. But they haven't really gained that perspective yet, so they don't really know what the end of the world feels like yet. Like this is all learning stuff. Like it's all just naturally doing the things they want to do because they've got urges to try to teach them skills. It's like lately the baby Reverend has been wanting to throw things. And you can tell it's not because he's mad and it's not because he's being bad or anything. It's just, he's almost 3. It kind of makes sense. He should be working on those bigger motor skills. And so he has urges that tells his little brain to work on it. Turns out being 100% quiet still and never making a sound is actually a sign that there might be something wrong or at least something that needs some form of therapeutic intervention. And for that I will say I'm not saying there's anything wrong if your child is autistic and on that spectrum, that far of it. But, it's just kind of the fact of the matter of when a child does that, that's not actually a good thing, but yet that's how all of society wants them to act. is very
Yeah,
docile and don't have needs and don't cry.
like, the crap that parents get if they bring their kids to a restaurant. You will have people, like, at other tables just, like, looking over with dirty looks at, a kid being a kid. Now, granted, if we're talking a kid at a restaurant that's like throwing food at other people at other tables, then yeah, I think that's a time where people at the other tables have a right to be miffed or whatever. But yeah, you can't be miffed at a kid for being a kid, just like you can't be miffed at a dog for being a dog. Like like a dog. There's a dog at work that like we have trees out there and leaves will fall, and he will grab a leaf at some point, but if one of the dogs happen to try to take the leaf from him, he'll start fighting, which is not cool. But, from the
Not
dog's
ideal, no.
not ideal, no. But from the dog's point of view, it's just like, this is mine. You're trying to take it. What's wrong with you? And you can kind of understand the logic. You don't want them to start fighting because, like dogs are, I believe it's been, scientifically proven that they are roughly comparable to like a kid that's around 2 or 3 years old, and a dog that's like 75 to 100 pounds of pure muscle getting pissed off, not fun.
Yeah.
But they're just young, and if you want to compare them to humans at the end of the day, even the older dogs.
Right. Developmentally, just the brain and how it works, like, is not geared to, excuse me, you have put your hands on that and that belongs to me, clearly. Like, right, it's not there for dogs, especially younger dogs, because they can have their aggression stuff worked out too, right? Like I've seen that being working in rescue, etc. Like you can work with dogs to get them better at like not being revenge seeking, basically, because they can forgive and forget. There's some animals that can't. I learned the fun fact recently. It's part of the reason raccoons aren't allowed to be domesticated, apparently, is because they have a concept of revenge. And I know crows also are not allowed to be domesticated. And we know crows have a sense of revenge. So apparently there's like more reasons to why certain animals are on the can't have list. But anyway, I digress. But yeah,
Yeah.
like I can't expect more emotional IQ from my 3-year-old than I expect from people like driving aggressively in traffic. Like, because basically, I feel like it's kind of the same. And modeling calm behavior is going to actually teach him more emotional regulation than anything. I'm not saying stuffing it down, I'm saying modeling calm behavior. Does the Reverend lose their shitteth sometimes? Absolutely, I do. I am not going to lie. However, I also like will breathe and calm down, and we try to choose to repair fairly quickly, right? And he's getting old enough for that matters, that's how we do things here. But we
Yeah.
address it, we talk about it. Actually had a really cute moment. Sorry, like I think it was last night actually. We got a new game. So basically, we got this new game because the baby Reverend, part of his preschool is just living life with me. That's the joke. I have this album that my friends can see of ZZ preschool, and it is just because the baby Reverend does life with me, and we just talk a lot. And so I take those little opportunities to teach him just while we're doing stuff, right? So we went and ran errands, and I needed to go to the craft store, and his reward was we could go to the game store at the end, and he got to pick this new board game. Oh my gosh, this is the first board game that's actually made this kid come alive. So we're super excited, right? So he wants to play another round, but the Mr. Reverend, he's studying for a very big exam that's coming up, and because he's finishing the next kind of next level up in his career, basically. So this exam will put him kind of at a next level. He wants to play again. I said, I can play with you. And he's getting tired, to his credit. So you know how your body kind of feels weird when you're tired, like when you think about it. So like think about that in a toddler's perspective. Of course they're more likely to wiggle and flail and do things, right? Like think about how toddlers and kids act when they're tired, and it totally explains it when they're still learning those body feelings. So he was starting to do that. I was recognizing it, thinking, I don't think a second round of this game is going to actually happen. And of course, he like threw one of the pieces down, and then I'm like, okay, we're done. And so I'm cleaning it up. The Mr. Reverend takes him to the bedroom, and they have this whole talk. And he comes back out and says, hold on just a second because I can actually pull this up because so they, go back in the bedroom and actually talk it out, basically. And he comes out here and just goes, "Zizi, I want to apologize. I'm sorry for losing my cool. Can we play a game?" I mean, in his toddler baby sense, right? And of course, then we played a different game, right? Because I wasn't going to allow the same game that kind of caused a stimulus issue. So let's just do something different. And yeah, like it's talking through, but the Mr. Reverend basically just went back and talked out and helped him understand what went wrong.
Yeah,
Like,
and yeah, I find in a way you can kind of do that with dogs too. Not obviously I wish you would not do this or whatever, but it's like, there are dogs at work that need a lot more attention than other dogs do. And what I have found is that the more positive attention you show the dogs that are giving you those issues, the more likely they will, respond to you if you try to correct their behavior. Being nice somehow works, believe it or not. People respond to that. Dogs
yeah,
respond to that.
yeah. And that's actually just how anybody learns, is
Yeah.
kind of guidance and examples. So anyway,
Anyway, well, look at that. Our friends are here. Thank you for joining us,
excellent.
everybody. This is Tim the Nerd, and joining me, we have the Reverend Tracy. This is Friends
Yeah.
Talking Nerdy, and we are going to be wrapping up History Month here by talking about why we discuss history in the first place, which I think is important, especially in the climate we have in the United States at the moment.
Yeah, something about repeating it, right?
Repeating it, and the fact that you do have a number of talking heads out there who are convincing some people that talking about history is somehow bad. I don't get the logic behind that myself, because I mean the fact is you do learn from your history. I mean, we've talked about it on the show before. When the pandemic hit, that it's like I was not a student, a scholar of history when it came to like the early 1900s influenza outbreak, but finding out that there were a lot of similarities between that and what happened with COVID, in terms of people denying it and ended up dying quite quickly because of that. People that were upset against mask usage because there was mask usage back in the influenza outbreak compared to the COVID outbreak and everything. There were just a lot of similarities, and in terms of world conflicts, same thing happening. You have leaders that are encouraging building of stuff like concentration camps that all of a sudden want to get into risky wars. Where did we hear that before, and where are we seeing that now?
We also have some reports, and I when I've tried to fact check this, I'll put an asterisk that they're reviewing what's going on. But there are apparently complaints in the military about, Christian extremist talk, like coming from up to down. I'm like I said, I don't want to try to throw quotes or anything because I know that is something that is being unfolding right now, and I would hate to misspeak depending on this coming out and what comes out between now and then. So yeah, that's an interesting thing to be watching, because that sure is from somebody's playbook, right?
Yeah, and I know what you're talking about too. Like, do I have the absolute facts that I can spout right here? I do not. Like the name of the organization, like there is an organization that soldiers can contact if they have complaints about stuff like that happening, and this organization has received, like, I believe over when I first read it, over like 200 comments that yeah, they do have generals or people in positions of leadership that are giving them emergency Bible studies, basically stating that their actions now in the Middle East, it will start the end times, that Trump was anointed by God so that Jesus could come back, because this is what the Jesus in the Bible would really want, right?
Oh, so much on that, which is funny because I'm currently working on a Reverend Tracy post because I decided to take a pause And I didn't do a Sunday post because life is busy, and also it's not like I have like a strong following on that page yet. So I think if I could take some weekends off, it's reasonable, and wanting to put more energy here anyway. But I something I was unpacking, because that's really what it is when you think about it. It's sermons written, to kind of unpack what I feel is maybe not the actual Christian response that is being sold as what should be the Christian response, if that makes sense. Like, I'm questioning the marketing being used here of saying, well, you should support this because it's Christian. And so sometimes I like to unpack those things and write sermons based on, what I feel the same scriptures and things being used might actually mean or not mean. Right. And so, like, hearing that, and especially because the Mr. Reverend and I visiting churches did happen upon a church very recently. Basically, it was the Sunday right after it happened that the bombings happened. And it sounded a little like crazy for us. Like, we basically, our skin kind of started crawling immediately. It didn't feel good. I'm like, no, no, I don't like that at all. I'm not to name names or throw churches under the bus or anything, but we don't intend on going back. That was quite a first impression, but it immediately made me go like, but where are we getting this? That this is what Jesus would want when you consider how many verses there are about loving your enemy and extending mercy over revenge. Like, where so that's what some of the sermons kind of are, is responding of like, did we read the same book?
Or even the whole, claiming that this will start the end times. I mean, it is very clear in the Bible that, and this is coming from an atheist, that if you try to predict the end times, you are wrong, because it will, they say it will happen when it happens, essentially. And, you do have Revelation being what it is, but like, the book of Revelation is so dense with like imagery and whatnot that it can be interpreted in plenty of ways. Like, take Jehovah's Witnesses. They've interpreted it at such a point that they felt that the end of the world started in like 1914, and basically that people that are that there are still people that are still alive that were a part of that faith that will be brought up into heaven, 144,000 people, and the rest of us will still be on earth and all that stuff, which there obviously, as more time goes along, that's going to be proven that they were, full of crap. But if you didn't know already, folks, spoiler. But
Yeah.
but just it's insane how these religions can just keep on going and keep on going with, like this end time stuff, with this prosperity gospel stuff. And I just don't understand why people don't see it for what it is. And again, there are good religious organizations out there, Christian, Islamic, and, Buddhist alike, that are doing the right things, even if I don't agree with their faith, but they're still doing the right things that, I could still support. But, like, yeah, how could you be looking at people dying, or, schools in Iran of elementary school children being bombed, and think this is what a loving God would want? Because at the end of the day, if that's what a loving God would want, I don't want to be with that God.
And that's exactly what pushes so many people away. Like, I completely understand some of the feeling pushed away out of the church, like, especially being of the queer community myself, LGBTQ plus. I don't remember where we're at this point, so I'm so sorry. I just don't keep my finger on that particular pulse. But yeah, like, being of that, like, it feels extremely unwelcoming already at a base level. And then so when you see stuff like this playing out in the church, it makes it even harder. But, like, so that's where it's like I see not liking going to church, but I really think it does a disservice to the ancient texts and what knowledge they were trying to pass down, whether you believe in it or not. At its base logical level, it is ancient knowledge being passed around the way that it could be back then. You didn't write something down for nothing, right? Like, it was important if it made to writing. So I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater when there is wisdom in there. Case in point, history repeating itself, kind of already covered in another book in a way.
Which book are we talking about?
Oh, the Bible. You know what I mean? Like, it's actually the mess that happens when the church gets tangled up in politics. Just Google that. Let Google AI tell you and explain how that's happened before already, and it already kinda showed that it plays out poorly when that happens.
Yeah, the Holy Roman Empire, everybody. History at the end of the day, it like I know a lot of people do, that are not necessarily fans of studying history, have, like homework trauma from back in the day from their history classes, back in like high school or whatever, and thinking back to how history was taught. They're talking about a wide range of history, and they're trying to explain it all in as short a time as they possibly can in those books. So on the one hand, I can kind of understand, why people would be kind of turned off by it. Learning about history, I think as we've discussed, it can be a survival manual, because it's like that old adage of, those that don't learn from the history are doomed to repeat it. It's like I don't see a situation to where everybody will learn from history and then we will have a utopia. I think we will, humans being humans, we're going to continue to have stumbling blocks upon stumbling blocks. But the more people that do take the time to learn about the history, to see the parallels in history, because like right now, like, we're in the United States, kind of parallel to the Gilded Age from the late 1800s. And, if there are people that are learning their history right now that are in positions of power that want to do the right thing, then they can, hopefully study like what Theodore Roosevelt did back in the day, because he was the one, the president that kind of helped put an end to the Gilded Age. And then, Franklin Roosevelt down the line from there. And you got other presidents that helped too. But, history can help you in times like this. It can be that survival manual.
Exactly, like, because it goes back to it really was meant to be knowledge passed down, but then it got turned into memorizing a bunch of dates and memorizing a bunch of humans' names in a particular order and all of this stuff. And it's like, yeah, it made history very off-putting and uninteresting. Now, tinfoil hat on, I would say that could be on purpose, because this goes back to, unfortunately, public education does have that drawback of they're saying teach this, not that, and teach this way. That does kind of open up to manipulate the knowledge of history, right? When you think of it that way. So,
Exactly. I mean,
intentional or not, it's shitty experience on history, and I understand. So, taking the tinfoil hat back off now, um, whether it's orchestrated or not, it's totally understandable why history in and of itself is off-putting AF to most people.
well, think about. I mean, I brought this up in the women's history episode that we did a couple episodes back about how, if you look in history books in, for like elementary or high school kids about the civil rights era, most of the pictures that you're going to see are going to be in black and white, and which kind of gives the impression to, modern audiences that, this is stuff that happened a long time ago, and is stuff that is settled. So, when they see a black and white picture of a young Ruby Bridges being brought to school with National Guard troops protecting her, they think that was something that happened a long time ago, not knowing that Ruby Bridges is alive and well today, and just in her mid 70s. Like, that seems
Right.
old, but, when you're almost 50, in my case, pretty darn close in age, and it's something that is not settled. And like, take two, Martin Luther King. I mean, a lot of the photos that you see of him, or the videos, are going to be in black and white, but he was on the Tonight Show at one point. People want to believe that like the civil rights era stuff was solved when, unfortunately, Martin Luther King was gunned down, and that is just not the case. Like my generation was like one of the first generations that, had fully integrated schools, and like I'm 49 right now. We're talking about history that is not that far in the past, also too, if we want to, tie back to the women's history episode, like my mom couldn't get a credit card until the 70s. on her own, not that her credit was the greatest and she could get one anyway. Like, and knowing her, she would have messed it up and probably had a lot of bills, but that's a different story. But, there were just a lot of things that we consider like ancient history that, and if you really think about it, just happened, and we're still fighting to keep those rights that we've gained, from being taken away again. Because you do have, when it comes to like women's rights, you do have people in positions of power today that think that women shouldn't have as much. I think it was the Pete Hegseth guy, the head of the Department of Defense. I'm not going to call it the Department of War, but he came out talking about how he felt like the women's right to vote, the amendment that gave women the right to vote, was wrong, and like people need to take this stuff seriously.
Right. And then also just another notable human that was totally around and has openly talked about his memories, his experience in the Jim Crow South, Morgan Freeman. Like, guys, he's still relevant. He's still, I mean, I'm pretty sure he's still around. I think I would have remember if he had passed away. I don't think he has. I know he did Story of God, which is a really great series if you can get your hands on that. But yeah, like he's even in Story of God, he's actually talked about his experiences in the civil rights movement. But anyway, yeah, like it's good to know and talk about these things basically. But there is kind of that funny thing of the so basically it's a documented phenomenon called historical presentism. Have you heard of this before?
I have not.
This kind of helps support it kind of plays off of those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it, but it's this tendency to assume that the current moment is somehow unique and unprecedented. And social psychologists have found that people consistently underestimate how current events have historical parallels, which makes them more susceptible to manipulation by anybody willing to supply a confident sounding narrative. Yeah, so historical ignorance is not neutral. It's very much because if that doesn't sound like our political field when they're talking, I don't know what does. Because it is that confident sounding, which also borderlines on what actual gaslighting is. I know we talked about the history of psychology, which will have aired before this. So, like, yeah, that's actual gaslighting. That very assertive narrative will make you believe things. So yeah, like when you want to believe somebody, like that already puts you at a place for that, right? So you want to believe that, oh, I couldn't have ever seen this coming because nothing has ever happened like this before. You're just going to believe them because you already base want to.
I think it was you who brought it up on a previous episode when it came to the pandemic, that we have one George W. Bush to thank for the preparedness that we sort of did have when COVID hit, and that's because he took the time to read a book about the influenza outbreak and learn
Yes.
about history, and decided that we should have some safeguards in place, because apparently before he read that book, we didn't really have anything, despite the fact that we had that history of influenza. It's like the people that were, alive, that were affected by it back in the early 1900s, maybe they were still alive, but they weren't necessarily, in a spot to where they could make any sort of meaningful change. It took him reading that book. And again, I'm not saying we should throw a parade for George W. Bush. All we've ever talked about on this show was talking about the importance of saying that if a politician, no matter what side of the aisle they're on, does something right, you acknowledge that. In this case, he did something right because, he understood that history isn't about worshiping the past. It's about understanding the present. And he, by taking the time to read that book about influenza, decided that we have to prepare today because we were not prepared, which was a good thing.
Exactly, because like I had seen this meme lately is like when you think your president is the dumbest man on earth leading us to an unnecessary war in Iran, and then like 2026 happens and you found there is an even dumber man. And it's like really funny when you think about it because we called him dumb, but that's what he did in his spare time. He didn't bump off and play golf at his own fudging resort. He went to his farm and read books on history to learn shit and gave enough of a shit to go, oh, we should do some shit about this. And it's like, it's so sad that, oh, we didn't know what we had. But yeah, like that inspired a lot of stuff. So I had actually remembered like right before the whole pandemic happened too about learning about like vaccine X, this concept of like, yeah, like based on like the idea of we might need a vaccine that would turn around quickly because we're due for the Spanish flu to happen again. That was already in the works, which kind of did, from my understanding of it, that's part of what worked into getting that COVID vaccine turned around so quick. 'Cause I know there's a lot of tinfoil hat against it. And hey, you guys know I respect the hell out of my tinfoil hats. But that one, but see, I think that has to do with the order in which I learned it. Because we had happened to watch this thing about the whole trying to make like a vaccine X, I forget what they called it, but just this general one where basically they could plug in the protein profile and have a vaccine that quick so they could be more responsive instead of how they made flu vaccines before. Because, spoiler alert, the Mr. Reverend is also a nerd, and that is the kind of stuff we like to watch. Even before COVID, we were watching stuff like that. Like we were Tiger Kinging, looking stuff like that up before Tiger King became cool. You know what I mean? But see, like I can't say how I would have felt about it had I not already been exposed to the information in the order of which I was exposed to it.
Well, but to be fair, though, just for you, of course, because I think I can speak freely on this. There's a difference between being skeptical and just denying any sort of facts that make what you think is the truth seem wrong. Because a skeptical person will take the time to read the history, do some research, blah blah blah, and then come up with an appropriate opinion at that time, even if it is against the initial skeptical thought that they had. Whereas, we're seeing it, we saw it during the pandemic. We saw it during the 2024 election. You have people that just have it in their heads that something's right. And it doesn't matter what you say to them. It doesn't matter how many times you say this politician who you're considering voting for did X, Y, and Z, which is clearly illegal. We should not give them, the keys to the castle again. And they thought, nope, I'm cool with it because my eggs are slightly more expensive today.
Well, and this also goes into, not to harp on my cognitive biases, because we know this is one of the Reverend's favorites, is the whole identity threat thing. Because when you identify as something, you really do need to be kind of careful about how you take information against the thing you identify as. Because if you're not really willing to be open and listen to it, you're going to shut it down because you're going to view it as an attack on your person. You're not going to view it as somebody trying to help you by giving you knowledge because they are attacking something that you identify with. So that really is it. That is what explains kind of a lot of how could they still. It's that. It is that part. And we're not encouraged to really like question that. That goes into, some of the stuff we've talked about with the history of psychology is kind of the danger of some of the clickable, shareable memes that make you feel good because they're angry and you're being passive aggressive and it's actually very much about a specific person, but you will never admit who it is, aka vague booking for those of us that are a little bit older. But that's kind of gotten to a toxic level as we've talked about. So I think it's kind of robbing people of having to do the self-reflection, to question that identity bit. Because when you make all of the problems and all of your head bumping always about other people, first of all, it feels really good to blame other people. Like psychologically, look it up. It feels great, but it's not the best thing. Like it's kind of like the whole just because you post something and it gets lots of hearts and likes and then you get a million followers and it feels good every time your stuff gets hearts and likes, just because it feels good, that can fall into the whole pleasure trap psychology then. So there's like kind of almost the two ends. There's the identity threat where you take things as an attack. And then there's also that like, but it feels really good to have people agree with me. And right, like, so you can kind of see where that makes this kind of environment with where we are now with social media of that's why people get so stuck in it because it's very easy to feel good constantly and get stuck in it.
Yeah, it's the echo chamber thing, especially in social media when you're talking about current event news of the day. A lot of the people that are posting stuff are not trying to be persuaders. They're preaching to the choir. And that is part of the problem I have with social media and why I no longer really actively engage about stuff politically. That doesn't mean I'm not political. And, we have plenty of episodes to show that. But, me going out there saying Trump is bad or, something a little more eloquent than that, I think my social media is a little more eloquent, but it would still be along the same lines if I did that, just me disagreeing. It's like I am not a persuader type of person. So me going out there trying to say something, like I'm not going to say something that's going to cause some rando like in Missouri to think, you know what, maybe he's right.
Right.
Hopefully,
Like,
yeah, and yeah, it's just like
judging
more
by
than.
some of the aggressive feedback I get when I just mention, like, by the way, giving your toddler chocolate every day is giving them caffeine and I think one to two other stimulants. I can understand why you don't want to respond on political stuff because, like, my goodness, parents who identify as great parents and having it all understood that they're like, yes, I am doing this for my kid and therefore it is great and I am awesome. Like, if they're at that level of identifying as a good parent, because hey, by the way, side note, it's great to identify as being good at things. I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying when you do identify as something, you should maybe consider a little bit of shadow work and humility in those topics, especially those topics, because you are going to be harder to take in information. And I think when we come down to it, it would be great if we could identify as people who care more about having correct information than being correct. So like anywhere you can make those pivots is going to be better for society.
Yeah, because we as humans do repeat behaviors the way dogs repeat bad habits. It's like we continue on with the same things. Like I was telling you beforehand, like my mother's before we were recording, my mother's little trick for us when we were young kids and sick. If she didn't have cough medicine available, and we're talking the very early '80s here, folks, her idea of a good medicinal thing to help me and my sister out was a teaspoon of honey and a teaspoon of whiskey. I mean, I'm sure that put us to sleep, you know, but it didn't really help with the cold that we had.
Right, but then there's the very famous Benadryl that has now but that mm, giving kids a little bit of Benadryl was a thing for a second before it started being very publicly and rightfully shamed. Maybe don't disorient your child. Maybe that's not the solution to them not going to sleep. Or, like I being from Texas, I still very much was raised in spanking culture and corporal punishment kind of being a quick go-to and being raised there and understanding it. It was never really about like beat your kids. It was really with that thought of, well, if you mess up bad enough, you're going to go to jail. And if you think a spanking sucks, jail is way worse. Like, right? Like, when you understand that that's where it comes from, I feel like it kind of takes some of the anger out of it, though. And a lot of people, especially millennials to boomer generation, really seem to want to be mad about it. And that I get that and I respect that because I've been going through that a bit myself. But, I think it could use to be questioned in multiple directions when we're going through some of that anger bit, right? Like, so beside the point, that's now changed, right? Now it's like you've got never spankers and you've got people that are still kind of in the middle of where it makes sense sometimes, but definitely not past a certain point for certain things. But see, if we don't talk about it, we can't change it. And then unfortunately, sometimes talking about something that did happen in the past, like kind of going through, especially the parent thing, because I think a lot of what explains some of that rift is that I do think our baby boomer generation really do identify as being good parents, that their kids survived, right? And so, see, this goes back to my favorite, the identity threat thing. So when they hear spanking is bad and does all these bad things, of course they're going to say, but my kid came out fine. Because telling them that they did something that hurt and damaged their child, I can see where somebody would take that personally when I unpacked it.
And I get that too. I just always fall back on that whole, anecdotal evidence doesn't prove the opposite of what you're trying to say, because there are exceptions to the rule. There are plenty of parents that did spank their kids, and those kids came up to be, law abiding citizens that contributed well to society. But the studies show that spanking your kids overall is just not a good thing, and something you should not do. And if you think about it, it's really is the easy way out as a parent, instead of taking that time to find a way to talk to your kid about, hey, what you did was wrong, and there's going to be consequences for that. It's just easier to bend them over your knee, couple of swats, and you're done. You're not having a conversation at that point. But to your
It
point,
goes
though,
back. A lot
to
of people are
identity.
being told. Yeah, yeah. Well, and also like spare the rod, spare the child. There was very much that narrative. Parents were encouraged to spank. And it's like we want to forget that. Me admitting that I wanted to forget that too. And the power of something being advertised and how much it can change a cultural norm. So yes, when parents were being told that, they were being told you are a bad parent and your child is going to have terrible outcomes and end up in jail and end up hooked on drugs if you don't do this. Understand that's what they were telling them. So I'm not saying you need to go and hug your mom that you don't talk to anymore because you feel like they spanked you too much, because your feelings are valid. That is a very valid response to have in life. I am just saying these are some of the things that help me move past that anger on that level to it. But now let's expand this to the big picture. America Land wants to identify as being great and always great. And I think that's why there's such this fight on controlling the history, is instead of viewing it as the greater good of learning, there's more value and identity investment in being great and having always been great. Meanwhile, you look at Germany and they do talk about the Holocaust because they value having learned from it and becoming better. So unfortunately, this might be our era of that, because history, it goes back to, we want to believe this is an unprecedented time, but like a lot of these things have played out, maybe not here, but in other places, and also probably here too, at least on different scales.
Yes, because empires do rise, they concentrate power, they overextend, and then they collapse. That happens every time. Every major, empire that you can think of, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Roman Empire, had that happen. And, you can kind of see it in what's happening in America today because of, like the whole concentration of power. Like, let's take the entertainment industry, for instance. If we take a look at the entertainment industry in the United States right now, it is consolidating like crazy. You have so few companies in charge of everything out there that it is causing huge problems, especially when it comes to how we get our news today. Take the Paramount situation. The people that ended up purchasing Paramount, the Ellison family, hardcore right wing people, and they thought, what we're seeing at CBS News isn't good, so we're going to install some of our own people, and that is turning out great. And by great, I mean bad, because you have them killing, not killing, but postponing stories that were negative of the Trump administration, postponing them in America, but they still were shown in Canada at the time they were originally scheduled to air, and then it ended up on their YouTube channel anyway. So stupid there. You have a number of reporters at CBS that are leaving, and they're just running that into the ground. And now the people that purchased Paramount are in the early stages of taking over Warner Brothers, who own CNN, who own a bunch of other things as well. And funny enough, the reason Netflix bowed out of the whole thing was that they looked at what Paramount offered and was like, this makes no financial sense. If this is what you want, cool, we'll just back out, because people are scared about the Paramount thing, when in reality, within a decade, they're probably going to have to break up that company anyway, because they're like in $79 billion worth of debt.
It's a rough time because like It even also goes back to like controlling the narrative and how we do have our news kind of advertised at us. Because okay, it's kind of a blessing and a curse because that means we don't have to rely on the news being portrayed on our cable stations for information anymore. It's not like when we were kids, right? We do have the internet so far, like we still have freedom and all of that. I would be extremely alarmed if they were trying to find ways to not allow me to watch like or listen to like Up First, for example, because I really love News Now and Up First are like my favorite two things to listen to back in the morning, because it just kind of very unemotionally tells you what's happened in the last hour. And then Up First is like all the major news stuff. So those are like the two things without getting way too into the political world that I try to listen to stay kind of somewhat aware of what's going on. So we do have choices in that respect, but it just sucks because it's like both sides are guilty of delaying news that they don't want to report on and da da da, all the things that you just listed. And every time, and it's so obnoxious at this point that side A will say, "Oh, well, your news outlet delayed this thing and they misreported this thing, so that's why do you even trust them anymore?" But then it'll turn around and person B can turn around and say the exact same damn thing to them about a different thing and say, well, you shouldn't trust yours either. It's like, okay. And I'm in the middle, like, maybe don't fully trust either one of them because you should be voting with your presence and not watching them if you feel like they are not reporting properly. Like,
Yeah, I
that
mean,
again goes into that what do you value more? The identity of wanting truth and wanting facts, because that's how you're going to have to, because they're going to make money off of every click. So if you find, for example, one is always really aggressive and you always feel like negative, scared, or angry emotions when you see their headlines, you might want to consider finding a different source of news. That's
agreed.
kind of a sign, yeah, that they're just trying to manipulate you into clicks so that they can get stuff. Like it's super annoying to watch it, but that's what's playing out.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, too, kind of piggybacking off of the empire's rise, consolidate power, and then collapse. We are seeing the collapse of what was the norm for us growing up. And that's how we were presented our media and how we're presented our news. Things are breaking up fast, and I think within at least the next decade or so, it's going to be a lot different. I mean, we could see like theoretically they could shut down CNN. I mean, I'm not saying that that is in the works or anything like that, but for what we took as this is where we get our news. Darth Vader himself approves, could easily just go away. And I think understanding history shows us that that happens. We can't take a love of like how we received our media. We can't take that love of how we received that media and be scared of the future. We have to understand that companies rise, companies fall, and we have to move on as consumers. And also too, kind of going back to the consolidating thing, like businesses that when they do consolidate, start making decisions that will benefit just the business. That's what businesses do, and if you can critique, big companies like that all you want, but if you have a small business and, you were presented with a choice that you don't morally like, but is still going to keep your business going, morally in a sense that, you have to hire an employee that, personally you don't think is the best person and the nicest person in the world, but they will help your business. You're going to make the choice that is best for your business.
Well, and it's funny because part of the argument for the current presidente was, feeling that America Land should be maybe ran a bit more like a business. That was part of early on where I was trying to be optimistic. I never really believed he would do it though, because he didn't in his personal business stuff. He wasn't very ethical. But the whole idea of running it as a business was kind of the thing, right? But what's funny is businesses are okay with using history as pattern recognition. So really ideally, if you want America ran like a business, we should be looking at pattern recognition, how other businesses, aka countries, perform when they make certain changes. Like if you want that, actually want that, because that one I actually can kind of agree with. Can we use maybe Australia's choice to completely ban guns to help influence our gun control? Not saying we have to do the exact same things. You go back in time, we talked about some of that, like way back when. That was one of my favorite episodes for the longest time. But yeah, like it would actually be kind of nice if America was ran more with an understanding of history acts as a mechanism for pattern recognition for humans. This goes back to not throwing out ancient texts. Just because you don't like how the followers talk about it doesn't mean there's not knowledge in there, because when it gets written down, that's what they're trying to do, is help with pattern recognition.
You could say the same thing with economics. I mean, there are booms and busts all over, recorded history, whether it be in the United States or elsewhere. But what you can learn from, studying what happened in those booms and busts will help you out today, because they are essentially reruns. Like the things that helped the stock market crash in 1929 were kind of the same mindset that happened that caused the stock market crash in 2008. Again, if
We make
everybody,
laws, right?
yeah,
Based off of pattern recognition. And like, oh, we shouldn't let this shit happen again. Look at like the Sarbanes and Oxley stuff from gosh, Aircon. What was it? Intercon, was that what was the huge one that like blew up bad for like insider trading stuff?
Enron.
Enron, thank you. Like Enron, I was like, I was so close, but yeah, Enron, like that was Sarbanes and Oxley. Like that's what came out of that. That made a lot of stuff illegal. It made a lot of like, hey, you have to have uneditable archives of your conversations with people. Because if you're doing this, we need you to prove to a level that you did not, if somebody accuses you of this. Like that's where that stuff comes from. So we, like, it goes back to, humans repeat behaviors collectively the same way we repeat them personally, and for the same reasons. Everything we know about individual habit and behavior change applies at scale. And this even talks about how we kind of worked our way up on the identity threat thing, right? Because our brains optimize for familiarity. We've talked about that before, even with talking about renewal and how we form habits, right? Familiarity bias, endowment effect, identity threat. Like this is all stuff that is playing in. But yeah, we want to default to known patterns even when they're not working, because known is safer than unknown. Nations and civilizations do the same thing because they're made of humans. We are just a gaggle of humans just wildly trying to make rules as best as we can. But yeah, like ultimately, that's where a lot of conservatism comes from, is the idea of like, you don't want to change everything. And that's where I think it has its place. It has a good temper for new ideas and new concepts, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't take in new ideas and new concepts. Because as far as like that, looking at other nations, for example, if we wanted to look at America and run it more like a business, and therefore take pattern recognition and what other countries are doing as an example, there is so much flipping argument for public access to healthcare, universal basic income. Like there are other places that are doing it, and it is helping people. But because of how it gets packaged to us, and how it goes back to taking advantage of that early phenomenon, that we want to believe that this is very unique right now. Therefore, none of that stuff is going to apply here, because I remember hearing that as part of the gun control argument of why we shouldn't do it. Australia, America's different. We can't handle like a entire gun ban like Australia. Like they don't have our history. Like, so it kind of all plays into that, right? Like talking about the why we should talk about history, and like back to why we should consider talking about it differently.
Yes, because history does teach cause and effect based on the things in question, like whether it be like foreign policy type of stuff, whether it be economic policies or something like that. Things repeat for a reason, and if you ignore the history, it doesn't make you original. It makes you predictable. It makes you predictable in the sense that you're going to repeat the same mistakes that your grandparents made. If you are coming from a family of stockbrokers that didn't learn about why doing certain things will lead to a stock market crash or something like that. I mean, you hear a lot about, like back in the 90s, you had the internet bubble. You had a bunch of companies that went public right away and made a lot of money money really fast, and then the bubble popped, and a lot of them, ended up, if unless they cashed out at the appropriate time, a lot of them went bankrupt right away.
Yeah.
And there are many, many examples of similar type of bubbles happening. Like right now, we're in the AI bubble.
Like, and it's really funny because we've had all of our transitions of, oh, this is going to be the bad thing. This is going to be the internet was originally like the next big bad awful thing. Before that, the printing press had its like, this is awful because look at how quick misinformation can be spread. Sound familiar? Look at how quick misinformation can be spread with the internet. Look at how quick misinformation can be spread. You know what I mean? So it's so funny to that example so many times in our history in so many locations. Like, it's not unique to us. And believing it is unique to us is kind of dangerous, and it makes you more susceptible to actually be manipulated around feeling that it's an unprecedented time.
Well, I think too there are some parallels between the printing press and the internet in a different way too, and that's the fact that we do get a lot more information thanks to that. Like with the printing press, the biggest group of people that were against it were the church, because beforehand, they had their own Bible that the preacher who or priest or whoever taught, but the people coming in for the weekly service didn't have their own Bible. They had to rely upon the people that were doing that teaching, and the printing press actually gave people the chance to have their own Bibles and to read themselves and to be like, wait, that's not what the Bible says,
Or,
And,
hey, you left out a part here.
and the same thing with the internet too. Like, there's a lot to critique about the internet. There was a lot to critique when it first hit it big. There's a lot to critique on it now.
Yeah, it's funny. The bishop Chris, my brother, he and I were talking about that very recently because I'm a little bit more okay with using AI in my life and to help organize and keep me on top of stuff. I think there's good practical application for it. My brother, on the other hand, is a little bit more against it. I don't know if I would say aggressively against it, but he's got good reasons. Like, not to make it sound like terrible, but like, having that conversation, and part of what he had brought up, because part of what I love about that big shocker is he challenges my biases. I love talking to him for that reason alone. Surround yourself with people who are comfortable challenging your biases. Anyway, so he was telling me about like the whole like using it for generated pornography. And that is a very real thing to talk about. However, AI is not the first one that has been brought up as the moral issue of pornography being spread, because we can date this back obviously to the internet. We can take this back also. That was one of the main concerns with the printing press, was distribution of pornography. So, and this goes back to, even the like cameras in a sense have had same skepticism of being able to take pictures of people. So, like, we've always kind of dealt with this privacy issue when we have new technology, but that doesn't mean shutting down the conversation entirely. And by the way, nightmare fuel, you want to go back in time, like, and telling this to my brother too, is like, dude, like, we lived through the wildest west of the fudging internet. Like, if you need to be reminded what that was like, go watch a little show called Web of Lies, because it pulls no punches in telling you how children got manipulated and killed that early on. Like, we watched that with my bonus babies, summer before last or last summer. I think we actually watched it over 2, and you could see it kinda click, like, this was why we were hesitant about social media and encouraging social media use, because that is just like a sub tangent off of the internet. Because we have to admit that social media and internet might actually should be another one in this list of historical repeats, because it is kind of its own thing because of its invent timing around the phone. Because I think the combination of social media and it coming out as a phone thing and constantly being on you makes it kind of different, arguably, in my opinion, than the internet. So it's its kind of own separate historical bump, right? So we keep seeing these things over and over. And instead of like learning how to try to regulate it, we just say nothing's ever been created like this before. So that's just me saying I feel like that's what we're doing right now with AI. It's another one of a history repeat. It's just the next technology that we're interacting with in bulk. And there's a lot of people, like when they come out wearing their tinfoil hats, pitchforks, and torches, it makes me take a pause and look into it and wonder who's going to make money off of us delaying how to do this right.
Yeah, because there's one example when it comes to AI that I can bring up here, and it involves one of your favorite bands, the Beatles. Um, and I say that sarcastically, of course, but their last song that they released a couple of years back, Now and Then, was done thanks to AI. Now, what do I mean by that? Because when people first heard that they were going to use AI in the track, they thought that some computer somewhere was going to take John Lennon's voice and just create a brand new song. That is not what happened. What happened was, thanks to Peter Jackson helped with this company, Weta Digital. They have an AI program that allowed them to take the original cassette tape that had the initial doodlings of John Lennon singing this demo version of a song Now and Then, because John in the late 70s recorded it on a cassette player. And it was just him and a piano. But what AI was able to do was separate the vocals from the piano, which was something because the Beatles tried to the remaining Beatles tried to release this in the mid '90s when the Beatles anthology documentary and albums came out. They tried to release it then, but they were not able to successfully take the vocals out from the piano track that Lennon did. But thanks to AI, that happened, and I think more than anything. I, like when it comes to AI, I think I've mentioned this on the show before too. I think people have kind of a fear of AI like they did of synthesizers. Because there was a time when people thought that synthesizers would make all the music. It would be in everything, and it's
Right?
not.
Auto
Now,
tune, right? Because how
yeah,
many songs were auto tuned for a hot minute there? And like, I can't think of the last time I heard something with that auto tune jerk. But it could also be because the technology's gotten better. So just beautiful looking people can sound like they can sing. I don't know. Maybe that's what's going on. But it kind of did disappear as far as like being noticeable because that was a trend in music for a while.
because yeah, I mean, you said it, the technology got better, and when it is used now, it is used in the best possible way, and it's not doing everything that people were scared of back in like the 80s or something like that. I think people had more of that mindset. Now there are some like environmental things with AI that to consider as well, and we can push those companies to do a lot better than they are currently doing.
And some of them are, guys. Some of them are working like, okay, think about it. It doesn't actually make a lot of sense with what we understand about closed loop systems to just burn through water. They are using a lot of water. Something I've learned, like, yes, there was concerns initially, but moving to closed loop systems, which they realized was also just more economical for them to keep it cheap, does kind of take away from that argument against it a bit. And then there's also the fact that and then we can do a total fact checked kind of prepped show about AI at some point if we want, like maybe what's going on with it now, right? Like where are we at with it? Are we burning through gallons? Are we burning rainforest? What's going on? Because some of it has some interesting pros to it, like making these big tech companies have to find ways to invest in diversifying our energy grid. So, really playing this the right way could finally get our energy grid more diversified and take away from this argument that we need to use as much oil and gas as we use constantly. Because now, if you've got the money that is behind big tech, which is our big money driver right now, like that would actually have a potential trickle down effect, which does happen sometimes, just not consistently enough to rely on it. But that is an interesting argument that I have read about it more recently. But you have to understand, I mostly think I'm a good person and care about the environment, but I also like the applicable uses of AI. So I'm recognizing I have a bias here with that. But that's where it's like I actually would actually like to do an episode because maybe I can spend some time researching and checking myself on it and we can talk about it.
Well, there you go, future preview, people. But
Teasers, the teasers.
yes, well, tying back into history, history does force you to ask when you are, reading specific historical, either events or stuff about people. It asks you, who wrote this? who benefited from it, who was silenced by it. Like if you're reading a book written by a politician, like one of my favorite politicians in history is Richard Nixon, myself. And, I've read his memoirs twice, and it's a long book. So reading it twice just, some people would be like, why did you read it through once, much less twice? But, when you read stuff like that, though, you do have to challenge yourself and not just take it as everything this person is saying is absolute gospel truth. And you do have to challenge yourself, like in the Nixon example, like, why did he write this? Who was his audience? What did he benefit from by writing this? And like my opinion on that has changed over the years, because like understanding his unique moment in history kind of parallels it wasn't as unique as I thought it was, because it does parallel a lot of what Trump is doing right now. Like Trump took the ball that Nixon had and kind of has gone a little bit further, but is still doing the same things, because Nixon was famously against the press. Nixon famously had that mindset of, well, I'm the president and I want to do it, so let's just get it done type of deal, regardless of whether it interrupted with laws or anything like that.
Yeah, because it turns out like when you want to do things your way versus the right way, you don't want pesky like people who would maybe criticize you watching you doing it and therefore recording you doing it. Not that it seems to matter, but
Yeah, yeah, but I think that is something to consider when it does come to history as well, because like if you study your history, it will make it easier for you to spot propaganda as well. Because I mean, if you were familiar with how things went in the past, then you're going to be able to see that a politician, insert politician's name here, that's spouting X, it's like, yeah, they're wrong, because this happened in the past and very much similar, proving them wrong. And kind of to your point, it kind of forces people, if they do study their history, to not get embedded in tradition, because we are like I'm sure every country has this fault themselves, but we here in the United States, we love our tradition. We love our Lee Greenwood, God bless America type of deal. And it's like, I love being an American myself, but we have to admit when we did wrong, you know?
yeah, but it goes back to it's really all larger scale of things we've talked about a lot recently. It's we like predictability, we like patterns and how they work out, even if it's kind of shitty for us, because there's comfort in it in a weird way. But the problem is that's not how you make things better.
Right.
That's the opposite, right? So kind of applying the same stuff that we talked about when we're assessing habits and whether or not it works for you, or even connections with people and whether or not that works for you. Like there's all of these themes that do go up to the greater scale, and it makes you go like, can we just please recognize that this is happening again, and like go back and address it the same way, and maybe this time really figure out how to make sure this doesn't happen again. And it goes back to how Germany handled it, which is the constant education about what happened, right? Because they're trying to present this so that it is remembered, and how much we don't want to repeat that in our history. So it goes back to just, it would be really great if we could just have this recognition of this way of doing things is not working, and we really do need to stop it if we'd like to survive America having its finding out moment of fucking around.
Because
Because
context,
yeah,
yeah,
yep,
context does kill oversimplified narratives and social media hot takes. I mean, and we've touched upon that with the social media hot takes and everything. Like those solve nothing. They make you feel good typing it. They make you feel good reading it if you agree with it. But context is king.
yep, because those social media posts aren't designed to inform you of jack or shit. They are informed to, or they are designed to get you to click on them. Whether that's because they're making you angry, because if you don't know how those algorithms work, like if you pause on something for 3 seconds, it increases the viewership of that post, guys. So they want you to pause. Those obnoxious videos that they're dancing with text and dumb stuff playing for effing ever before they make their point is because that makes you watch it longer, which makes their page look like it's actually interesting. And therefore, the algorithm will push it to more people. It is all manipulation. So, therefore, yeah, it's more fun to take the context out of it because it's easier to use it in that sense. A quote, an image, a statistic, a headline, if it's stripped of its context, like it's just being deployed to you. Like, okay, I loved this when I kind of like came across the stuff was the idea of history is essentially the discipline of adding context back in. So like when they take away the history, the culture, and this is like the same thing that I go on about when it comes to the stories written about in the Bible, is like a lot of those later letters from Paul were very much to the context of a specific culture and church that was going on, and it was never meant to be broadly applied. So kind of the same concept is when you're taking away all of the context from somebody's quote or all of the context out of an image, you're taking away like probably upwards of 80 to 90% of what that thing even means. So, yeah, it's flashy and it'll get you to click on it. It might even make you angry, which gets you to linger on it for 3 or more seconds. But just understand that if you're seeing those types of posts, that's what they're doing. They're just trying to get you to stall on it or get you to watch it for long.
Because when we are talking about like political stuff, for example, with social media clicks and everything like that, if too many people do fall into that trap of, there must be easy solutions here, and when you go on a grand scale of national or worldwide politics, no, there's not. Like if you live in a small town of 1,000 people, maybe there are some simple solutions, but if you go up into a big town like Portland, Oregon, what will work here is not going to work, in a much smaller town in Oregon, because we have a lot more people to deal with. And if you learn that context of why, a particular thing is done in a particular way in a certain part of the country, then you can begin to understand it. And, another reason to learn history. Yeah.
Yep. And also, people love simple answers, Tim. That's just how it is. It goes back to cognitive science. It's simplicity bias, or they call it simplicity preference sometimes. Because, like, yeah, in everyday decisions, we want simple rules over problematic thinking. So, yeah, if it's like, "Hey, that sounds like a good solution, I'll take it." Like, there are people who won't question it any more than that because it sounds simple enough. And if their logic or common sense tells them that it sounds like a good enough of an idea, they'll run with it. It even goes back
Immigration.
to, yep, immigration. It even goes back to some of the stuff we talked about. Parents being told you need to spank your kids. It made sense when you didn't want your kid to end up getting hit by a car, from running out in the street, getting in jail, getting, into drugs. Like when you're told that's the stakes, and this is a simple, you just do this. This is what you do to not have that happen, right? You want that simple cause and effect relationship. You don't want 20 steps in therapy, even though that's what's actually going to probably work. But we want simplicity and we crave it. And it goes back to if you don't understand that about yourself, you're going to make those types of decisions. And either you're going to feel very bad about them later and very regretful, or you might get stuck in that identity threat bias of saying, but I'm a good person, so I can't believe that that was a misstep. Right?
Well, yeah, and a lot of what you're talking about too is stuff that we in the past thought was common sense, and common sense changes. I thought of, I mean, I brought up the example of my mother with a teaspoon of honey and a teaspoon of whiskey. I mean, for her, that was a common sense thing you did because her parents did that for her, and I'm sure their parents did that for them. But no, that just put your kid to sleep. I'm sure she enjoyed it with how rambunctious me and my sister were, but that didn't help us with our colds at all.
Right. It goes back to how they justified a lot of electrotherapy and stuff in what was more like the warehouses when it was the asylums, right? Talking about the history of psychology. And it was like, it felt like common sense in that way because they proved it right there, right? I shocky you, and now you are way more docile and easy to handle. And so that's where, like, I don't like the term common sense. I don't like it when people get judged for not having it because, much like a quote or a picture, when you strip a tidbit of common sense away from its culture and away from all of its context, you're not getting the full picture. And what I mean is common sense is very much directly affected by not just your culture, but also your privileges and things that you have access to, right? Because money management skills, for example, is probably more easily taught in a home that isn't financially struggling. So you can do it and kind of understand along with your parents. And therefore, I could see where that would make it easier for a kid to learn financial literacy. But since most of America is not incredibly great financially, it's very hard. And we've got missing gaps where financial literacy is not being taught. So,
Well,
right. So, depending on what household you're in, is going to depend if you have financial literacy in your common sense tool belt.
yeah, and I mean, I was going to say, like, in terms of America, at least, I think the middle class, the lower middle class to poor people, do have they're not in the privileged sense because there are a lot of policies in place that make it very difficult for them to even survive. Much less have conversations with their kids about saving money or anything like that. I know my oldest, for example, he is understanding now a lot of the struggles that me and his mother had growing up financially, and because he's made comments before about how it seems like just when you get to the point to where you are slightly getting ahead, something happens, and like, yeah, that's life. But a lot of people, I think if we didn't have some of the economic policies in place, and this is a side tangent, of course, but if we didn't have some of the economic policies in place, then maybe people would be better at financial literacy. But right now, a lot of people are just struggling paycheck to paycheck. Even people that have like high 5 figure or low 6 figure salaries, if you think about it, just because they're making 6 figures or even 7 figures doesn't mean that they're so flush with cash that they can do whatever. Because
Exactly.
we're talking they have cars, they have homes that they purchase, they have taxes they have to purchase, because if you're making 6 7 figures, you're not doing a simple W-2.
Right. And then also you have to realize commercialism before you judge anybody for spending that much money like that. Like, no, commercialism encourages that's what you're supposed to do. And that goes back into where we've talked about like normalization. That was more in the history of drinking, about how much influence normalization through our media has on stuff. But yeah, no, so that takes us back to, larger scale, bigger. Common sense has historical context. And so when you remove like the history and the culture around common sense, right? Because it goes back to looking in time, it changes, and that's a good thing. Lobotomies were a Nobel Prize winning medicine in 1949. Separate but equal was constitutional law. Every era has had a set of ideas that nearly everybody accepts without question. History teaches you that you probably have some of those too, and that's very uncomfortable for people to realize about themselves. It goes back into, you feel threatened. You feel like you are being threatened, almost in the same way of somebody saying, I'm going to punch you, because of how our brains work around feeling threatened.
Right. But I think also another thing to consider too is that history, in a positive way, trains skepticism within you without cynicism, because, we've talked about it before. There is nothing wrong with being skeptical about, a choice a major corporation makes, or a choice that a major politician makes. But if you're just completely cynical in your head, you've already determined that that choice that, the politician has made will automatically be wrong and bad. You
It's
know,
kind of the opposite of that scale, right? Of believing everything versus believing nothing. And it turns out both extremes are probably not the best mentality to hold.
yeah, just turn on the news and you'll see that happen. But that is the benefit, though, of learning your history, because again, I will repeat it again. There is nothing wrong with being skeptical. Be skeptical, people, of things that you think are not a good idea, but you don't want to be so caught in your identity that you turn into a cynic, because I think cynicism has partly led us to what we're facing now in the United States.
Yeah, normalize that you can be wrong sometimes. How about
Yeah.
that one? Instead of constantly surrounding yourself with messages about how you are right and everybody else is wrong, question that and find your things that challenge you. Find your people that challenge you a little bit too. It'll keep you proofed of this stuff, but you have to actively seek that out. You're not going to find that in the groups where you are all sharing the same narrative and all sharing the same like conversation points, right? It's only going to happen when you branch out, when you're willing to talk to other people, and it's like everything is encouraging us not. Both sides are like, oh my God, I can't believe you talked to somebody wearing a red baseball cap. Oh my God, I can't believe you talked to somebody wearing a queer pride pin. Like, but the point is we should be talking because if we want to see any change, we need to humanize each other again. Otherwise, it is still just going to be old school in grouping, out grouping, and effective polarization is going to keep doing exactly what it's doing because it goes back to historically, this has happened before.
Yeah, and I've talked about it before, and I keep saying that. Hey, I talked about it before. Um, I think I have grown politically in my political views ever since I have made that concerted effort to find other sources of news out there coming from people whose perspective I may not agree with. Like I take the time on occasion to read articles from the National Review. The National Review is a noted conservative organization. From day one, they were telling the conservative viewpoint. I am not conservative myself, but I think taking the time to read some of those articles, even though I've gone through some of them and like, oh, F you, but taking the time to read those articles and also get my news from other sources that are not, like they call it MS now instead of MSNBC since they were spun off from NBC. I was guilty of being in that information bubble, and the moment I broke out of that and made an effort to hear other viewpoints, I think the more nuanced I became in terms of, not instantly stating, like something is bad. I guess if that makes sense. Like,
Yeah, I
I
mean, I think our listeners could actually hear this though, I think in you. Like early episodes, I think about when we first started recording, I used to pull that and I'm not taking credit for your growth. I want to put a huge thing on this. But I remember I used to say kind of deflecting it with humor a bit of it's the way of the Sith to deal in absolutes, Tim. Like I want to say I said that a few times on the show and but ultimately it's your choice though. You choose, Tim, to have people in your life that kind of maybe can help nudge you back and say, like, question that. Like, hey, you know how that meme made you feel really pissed off? Why? What do you think they're getting out of it? Because right, like, is there any argument that this wasn't built to make you mad? I'm not saying these were example like conversations that Tim and I had. This is just like when I see somebody sharing something that is very obviously meant to be rage clickbait that it makes me wish people could take that pause instead of having 20 of their friends like it because that is the slippery slope of the negative aspects of social media with stuff like that because that's just how easy it happens. You get upset, you share something, your friends like it, so you're getting that positive reinforcement that they like it, like on top of it, feeling like it resolved it, right? Because it made you angry and then you did something. And I just realized this goes back to habit forming, right? Because that's a positive feedback loop right there. Something made you angry, so it caused a problem. You shared it, so you feel like you did something about it. And then you had a bunch of people thumbs up it, which says, we liked how you dealt with this. So there's your interesting feedback loop right there. Just as easy as that.
And it's hard to break free from that because if you break free from that, like in terms of posting like political stuff, for instance, you could lose some of those friends, that previously agreed with you on stuff before. That's something to consider. But and I would argue that maybe they weren't your friends in the first place. If they're gonna not follow you or be friends with you because you suddenly don't agree with everything they believe in.
Yeah, and that's kind of where it's made it difficult too in the social media world is it's just so easy to get your circle bigger without having that pesky social, social response to maybe you not making the best decisions, like culturally, right? Like, or having the best opinions. It is easier now than ever, even if you are of the few, to go find enough of the few mentality to support what you want to believe, right? Because it used to be back in the day that if you believed something that people thought was gross or that people thought was bad or to some context evil, dare I say, like, you would be ostracized. And that social punishment meant something because we're social creatures. So in a way, it was a way of getting feedback that that's not a good thing that you're doing or believing. And we've kind of lost that. So, I mean, granted, you've also found like where you can find connections with people, like in good positive ways too. But this is where it's like, I don't think the internet and social media are fully good or fully evil. I think there's just not enough going to safeguard, especially kids right now, against having the negative repercussions and kind of dealing with some of the mental health fallout that came from my generation being put out to the wild west of the internet. Because I explained the whole chat room. Have I said this on the show before? Like, that I explained like early AOL chat rooms to my stepkids?
I don't recall that, no.
Okay. So it was super funny. I was telling my bonus babies about, like, because we were watching Web of Lies, and they were like, I don't get it. Like, how are these kids like talking to these adults? Like, oh, so that chat room, you see how they're saying like ASL? You used to just go in there and be like, your age, your sex or gender, and your location. And like, and people would just answer that. I'm like, yeah, that was us. We thought that was super smart. Like, yeah, sure. 14 female from Texas. Come talk to me, 32-year-old male from Ohio.
What could go wrong? Yeah.
All in the same room, all in the same room. And social media is making the same mistake, right? Like, kids and adults, like, we've already had this experiment with not intermixing those crowds. But anyway, so it's like it goes back to like talking about it is important. And if somebody doesn't want you to talk about it, you might want to consider who's making money off of you not talking about it.
Yes, because history is our collective memory. You know, it is messy, it is selective, it is emotional, and it's also why groups tend to cling to heroic versions of themselves. You know, like in America, you do have a bunch of people that will cling to the image of the founding fathers as these holy people instead of understanding that they were just as flawed, if not more so, than us. I mean, the people that helped lay the seeds for the freedom that we have today had slaves. No, you know?
Well, and that goes back to the unfortunately something that I tend to agree more on the conservative side with, that causes a lot of friction with my more liberal or progressive friends, is that we throw out the baby with the bathwater on people for stuff that was kind of normal back then. That's where it's like, even with the parent-child rift that I want to bring up, just because the mental health and where we can tie it there to understand is like, maybe not demonizing every parent that spanked in the millennial age group, because they were doing something that was very common sense. If you cannot hear my quotes, they're around that at the time. Owning slaves was unfortunately some point common sense, because that was the social norm. You just did it. You didn't question it. It goes back to, we've had a long history of believing things were okay because that's just what was around us, and that's how that works.
And I did bring this up in the women's history episode. I mean, it is important to, based on what you said, to not view history in the lens of today. You know, and I brought up the Star Trek example. You know, you're like, Star Trek, what does that have to do with the founding fathers? But Star Trek, if you look at the character of Uhura, as originally presented in the original 1960s TV show, and you look at it through a today lens, not the best character. However, in the 60s, Uhura, being played by a black woman on television in a position of power, was important for people to see and was the best possible thing to happen. And I think people do tend to make that mistake when it comes to historical figures. And I'm not, and please, people, don't take this as me trying to, be an apologist for slavery. Slavery was bad. They should not have owned slaves. Let's get that right.
Remember,
But
here
we,
at Friends Talking Nerdy, we are about learning about it. We nerd out also to learn. So that's what we're saying right now, I think, Tim, right?
yes, 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 yes. I mean, so we want to understand that context. It's like, to your point. Yeah, back in the 1700s, it was just common practice, just like it would be for rural people to, own a cow.
Yeah, I'm not
And
saying bring it back. I'm just saying I understand the concept about people doing things because a lot of people around them are doing it. And that maybe that didn't make them a bad person. And that's like where I don't think it's right necessarily to strip down honors and strip down like history and try not to talk about these people.
yeah, if anything, you don't want to mythologize the past so much that you don't learn from it. And I think when it comes to the slavery issue, I think we did learn some from it. I think we have a lot more to go. I think we did learn it to the point to where, yeah, slavery is no longer allowed in this country unless you're a prisoner, and that the 13th Amendment. And I think that's a different thing altogether that could be studied and learned from and changed, hopefully, somewhere in the future. But
Or you're a
different.
student that took on a lot of federal student debt. Just saying. What? What? There's
Hey
there's an argument
now,
about how that's kind of like that we kind of got set up.
just a bit there, yeah.
Just a bit, especially like some of the tongue-in-cheek commentary on the loan forgiveness for public service. Anyway, there's a little bit to that I kind of have feelings on. But student loan forgiveness is great. Don't get me wrong, and I do believe, especially in the public sector, hands down. But there's some interesting arguments that say that is more about putting people in a financial situation to have to work for way more in their life than people who don't need to be in that financial situation. So I will put that little nugget out there. I know there's a lot of talk about student loans going on right now because of things going on in the courts. So it's a little bit on my mind, I guess. History repeating it. Anyway, but I think we were talking about collective memory, weren't we?
At some point. But what we don't want to do, I mean, like, forgetting history won't heal wounds. It reopens them later with interest, in a sense that, like, going back to the slavery thing. If we just completely didn't learn about the fact that our founding fathers had slaves or whatever, w- later generations would not have been able to come to a point to where we could say, you know what, that's kind of wrong, we shouldn't do that. And I think that is the important thing to learn about history, why it's important. Like, I think it was pointed out that, like the Ruby Bridges example, for instance, like a lot of the people that were throwing insults, a lot of her fellow students that were throwing insults at her, are the people that are kind of pushing for history not to be taught.
Yeah.
Basically because they don't want their grandchildren, I guess, to see pictures of them, doing that in history books. And it's like, we can't do that to ourselves, even if it makes us look bad by, stating, I used to do X, Y, and Z. Like, we should learn from that history. We should be open enough to be able to tell younger generations that, yeah, I did this and it was bad.
Yeah, but that's going to have to take a cultural shift on what we value as an identity. Unfortunately, in America right now, we do seem to value shit not stinking over learning things and being like informed, like actually informed. And it's just not something that seems to be valued. We don't even seem to like sharing knowledge, which is crazy because that goes back to that's how we like survived as a species. And it goes back to that's why things were written, because a lot of the history books and some of the argument I made during the psychology episode, what is it other than just written logging down what was seen or visually, like almost scientifically logged with our eyes? We just didn't have like microscopes and other ways of measuring things. But that's why history is important. It's watching the patterns and the observed behaviors and the outcomes of them. The whole point was always to learn from it. It wasn't to always make people sound wonderful and like they weren't terrible. The point of history and sharing it was supposed to be to learn from it. So it's just so obnoxious when people rail against learning history, and it like, immediately gets my skepticals up about an institution or a person.
Yeah, because ultimately we do want to understand the moral frameworks of different eras without excusing them. We want to understand why it was common practice back in the day for people to own slaves without being totally cool with it ourselves. We want to understand that rationale so we can learn from that and be better, and we also want to be able to, ideally to see people in the past as humans, not stereotypes. We don't want to see George Washington as this great holy figure. We want to see him as a human being who made mistakes, who did stupid things, but as but for the good that he did, we can learn from the good that he did. We can also learn from the bad that he did, and I think of like Martin Luther King Jr. as well. Like, he did a lot of great stuff, also cheated on his wife a lot.
Oh yeah, he loved rubbing elbows with the white ladies was my memory on that one. Like, oh man. But right, but these are humans. Like, exactly. Like, I cannot agree anymore with, I think, anything you've ever said is taking people as humans. And I'm not saying this really applies great across every human. Like, maybe people don't want to hear this about like Hitler or Stalin, but but I mean, ultimately they were humans, and if you want to be a Hitler sympathizer, hurt people, hurt people. I don't know what his whole story was, and I don't care. He definitely did a lot of bad shit. I'm glad, like, realistically we can at least know that he's not around anymore, right? Because there's a lot of people that have theories on whether or not it was actually his body or if it was one of his doubles, because he had doubles. So there's some of that tinfoil hat level conversation on it, but like for the most part we can safely assume he's gone, like with the
Yeah,
age that he would be.
imagine getting that job. You could be Hitler's double. Ooh, okay.
Oh, this is a great honor.
What's the worst that could happen? But I think back to going back to Nixon. I watched his funeral, and Bill Clinton gave a eulogy at that, and he talked about, when it comes to an historical figure like Nixon, it's not about talking about the one bad moment or the one good moment. It's about the summation of the entire person's life. And when it comes to someone like Hitler, yeah, the summation of his life, he may have done some good things for Germany, let's put it that way. But everything else was bad. Bill
Yeah.
Cosby, yeah,
Commissioning the
Bill.
Volkswagen Beetle, that was pretty cool, like, because that's a him thing. But, but see, but I kind of to the point, it's interesting that car is still around. Like, so it's not the canceling everything of him. And some of the scientists that eventually came over and helped us get to the moon, right? Like, if we did apply kind of what seems to be how most people want to apply, of doing bad means all bad, even though Hitler arguably super fucking bad. Don't not hear that from me. Um, but like, even as bad as he was, how times have changed, like they didn't throw out everything from him. Right. So, because there are things to learn from, whether you want to take any good things that came out of it, and there could be others too. Like there could be actually bigger political things that possibly was done positively. I don't know. I just, my funny fact, stupid thing was the Volkswagen Beetle. But you can take either as a good example or anti examples, and those can be from the same human on the personal scale or on the big scale. I go back to think about your parental relationship, because I think that's the one thing that a lot of people can relate to. Like most people can identify as relationship to parent on this, right? Like, oh, I kind of forgot where I was going with that, but just larger scale, smaller scale. They're not, oh, there we go. They're not perfect people, basically. So there's probably a lot of things your parent did that was good, like they fed you, they did their best to feed you based on what they were told was healthy, by the way. But maybe they did also spank a lot because that's what was normal back then to do. So, right, it goes back to that whole a smaller scale, bigger scale. Was everything they did so bad? Or was it just some things they did bad because maybe they didn't know better? Like, is there that to it at all?
Well, I mean, history does make you realize that, you yourself have probably believed some of the dominant ideas of your time as well. Just like our parents did back in the day when it comes to stuff like spanking. That was a dominant idea of that's a positive that you just do that. If your kid does something wrong, spank them. We've learned from that. But there are also things that I'm sure we as parents today, thankfully, like my youngest is now 20, folks. So, while I'm still a parent and still, have things to do, in terms of the younger stuff that is no longer my wheelhouse. Thank goodness we don't need more young me's out there. There are also dominant ideas that we follow today that we think are right that history will come to show that maybe are not so right, and we have to a history will make it easier for us to accept that. And I think at the end of the day, if we do understand that concept, then maybe when we do come to a point to where a certain idea that we thought was a great idea was a dominant idea in society turns out to be wrong, we're more likely to say, okay, I was wrong, I will move on too.
Yeah. And by the way, knock knock to my fellow millennials, Generation Xers. If you don't want to be that hated parent, start challenging that stuff now that you maybe didn't do everything as well as you not could have. Because see, that goes back to argument of like the whole common sense thing, that potentially anything you did that felt like it was common sense, like you need to be open to your kids maybe wanting to have conversations later about things that they learn, right? Because that's actually going to solve the wound a lot more for both of you than just, well, it was fine at the time and you turned out okay. Because, right, that sounds familiar, right? So we can work on not being those people. And hey, good news. If you can flex those skills as a friend, as a parent, as a lover, like you can do that in other realms as well. Our brain is so much more a muscle than we want to realize. That's why I like tying this to things that are more relatable, like the parent-child relationship. Because if you can start there, that might honestly be easier than challenging some of your political identity, because it goes back
It,
to, if you identify as an abused or neglected child, that is something that's worth challenging, not to deny your own history, but challenging it in the sense of the intent versus impact thing, right? Like, so basically, being more of that person, I think, will make you more open across the board and overall a better human, of being able to kind of question things that threaten that identity, no matter what that is. If that's an identity that you feel like you are a very good person, or if it is the identity that you feel like you have been grossly mistreated. Because how many people out there feel like you grossly mistreated them at some point, but your perspective is that that doesn't align with you being a person that is generally good to people? But now they only will treat you like you are a piece of shit person. So if you can understand that, that also ties into why it's so hard for anybody to change their mind about anything, because we don't exactly accommodate and welcome people that change their mind, because we really like that all or nothing. It's tasty, right? To be like, you showed me a sign that you were bad, so just get out of our society, right? We exile them from our lives. We yeet them, as it were, more recently. I don't know what term it is now. I don't know what the 6-7 thing means. I just know it keeps coming up every now and then. But we
yeah,
get rid of people that, if they show signs of not being great. And so, as much as we want it to be that simple, it's not. Humans are humans, and they're going to do some things good and some things bad. And I think that is why it is so important to be humble about how we ultimately judge people. You can judge Hitler all you want. I think we've all decided culturally across many nations that one and Stalin are totally safe to be like, yeah, garbage human. But most people aren't Stalins and Hitlers.
yeah. Well, if anything, history will give you a humility check because future generations will judge us just as harshly as we judge other generations. And I think back to the '90s in terms of our entertainment. Our entertainment was a lot more edgy, was a lot more not caring about the repercussions of just what we were, joking about or having fun with, like Jerry Springer stuff or Howard Stern stuff, which doesn't mean that, I think that, that type of stuff should be banned or anything like that. But like it did set a mindset of not caring about just what if you're making jokes about women, for instance, it was not a good thing, even if you laughed at that particular time. And we should be judged harshly for that. We should be humble enough also to say, yeah, I used to like that because I used to love Howard Stern back in the day, but that whole locker room mentality that he kind of fostered and kind of helped grow was wrong in a lot of ways, because locker room mentality, if you're talking about just joking with your friends, that's one thing, but doing it on a broad scale and encouraging other people to engage along with it, that was bad.
Right. Like we're supposed to move forward from stuff too, right? Like the whole idea, like there's a lot of things that you think are great and good and awesome. And it's just all about how you respond to information. I think, oh, you know what I used to think was awesome, Tim? Packing and opening a new pack of cigarettes. Oh, that was a time that I used to look forward to in my life, just delicious nicotine and smoke and terrible breath, but I loved it. But you learn information and you ideally stop doing things once you learn they're not good for you, right? So and that's the problem when the past has this narrative of being pitched that there was some golden age, right? Going into That's why authoritarian movements love that idea so much. Every populist uprising in modern history has built on this myth of a golden age, a better time that was somehow taken from us, to which we must return. And if that doesn't sound like the "Make America Great Again" thing, I don't know what does. There's also been "Take Back Control." But right, like the specific context varies, but the structure is very identical. And the myth does the work of defining who we are and who the enemy is and what victory looks like. And it goes back to being presented as a nice, tidy, neat solution to a problem. Oh, prices are up and you're unhappy and there's no houses for you to buy. Well, let's talk about the golden age of which everybody could own a home and gas was under $1 a gallon. Like, yeah, okay, we can appreciate that there were some good things about those times, but that doesn't mean you should go back to everything about that time, right? Because nostalgia is great. Nostalgia itself is not dangerous. It's human and sometimes it's very beautiful. And sometimes we do get some good spin-off shows that happen based on nostalgia and reboots. But like it can be dangerous because it's the same thing that we kind of talk about a lot is people are going to use these concepts of psychology to manipulate you if they can get money from it, right? Because that's where nostalgia, yeah, they want you to watch the movie, right? Obviously, they're getting money for that. So, but when we turn it around and we politicize this idea of there having been a better time, it's pretty easy to see how people can get hooks into others and use that narrative to steer. Like, oh, well, back then, women stayed at home. So therefore, that must have a butterfly effect of why houses were so cheap. And nothing really supports any of that, but it sounds good, right? It sounds simple. And when you understand that a lot of what drives us as a group of humans is just the bigger version of what drives us on the micro level, like you understand where it's like a politician pitching a solution is it is this easy sounds very good when you are the person struggling with the problem. When
And,
you don't want to pay high taxes because you're already feeling taxed to death as a hard working steel worker or manual labor person, like that tends to, not necessarily make the most money and doesn't get a lot of these benefits or feel that they get, because, right, you make too much money to get some of the social benefits. So of course you don't want to pay for other people's social benefits, right? So it's easy to see like, oh, well, your problems are because we're paying for too much healthcare. And we're paying for too much healthcare because there are these immigrants that are just here and like we're just paying for their healthcare, which is ridiculous by the way. But that's how easy it is, right? Because, oh, so if you take care of the immigration, my taxes get lower. And that's how some of that stuff gets its hooks in people because there are a lot more Americans struggling paycheck to paycheck than Americans who are not. And when they see so much percentage of their paycheck being taken for taxes, when they see, but that's my resource and I could use it for my health care. It's really easy to take advantage of that because not only are you now threatening identity, you're threatening their sense of security for their home.
and also too, it's exploiting people that are not taking the time to actually find out that, a lot of these taxes that they're paying are because people that are far richer than them are getting a lot more tax breaks, are able, because, like, I think it was like Warren Buffett or somebody, discovered, like, his secretary percentage wise was paying more in taxes than he was. And his secretary, I'm sure, was probably making a good six figures, or something like that, working with a billionaire, or something like that. But it's, that should not be the case. But most people are so involved in just their day-to-day life that they don't either have the time or the desire to dive into the weeds of, when it comes to stuff like tax issues, and it becomes easy to fall under the sway of a politician that's going to say, I'm going to fix this. And I just wish people would, take the time to challenge that more, because you want to go back to the Make America Great Again. That was also a campaign slogan for Ronald Reagan. And a lot of the things that Trump is doing today is stuff that Reagan did. And yeah, as a progressive, I'm pointing out, negative conservative examples. I'm sure, you could point out negative progressive examples over the years as well, because, you don't solve things by just throwing money at it either, and even though there are some studies that show, like, for homeless people, for instance, if you just give them like $1,000 per month or something like that, most people will invest that properly and, end up not being homeless. The numbers show that people don't want to be homeless. And if you give them some income, then they will not be homeless at that point. But, but,
Right. And
but
universal
yeah.
basic income concept, right? Like I almost like wanted to try to run this down, but I feel like I think we've talked about that as a pro and con before.
Yeah, we've had an episode
Okay,
on it.
I was
Yeah.
pretty sure we had, 'cause that's like one that I feel like I felt strongly enough about historically that I would, because that and gun control, right? Like kind of those topics. Like I'd be surprised if I didn't suggest it at some point to talk about it. But yeah, like some of the whole purpose of UBI is so businesses can afford to pay people, but people could afford to live. Like it gave kind of a basic, like, here, you can have a house because, yeah, whether or not you want to recognize it or not, we kind of need people to work at the restaurants if you want a restaurant to eat at. So if you're saying that you don't want a restaurant experience enough to validate that human getting paid for to like live somewhere and afford rent and electricity and water, like you don't actually want the restaurant. You want indentured servitude. Like you just want people to feel like they have to fucking work for you to feel happy, because I don't think this is fully the fault of the restaurants either, because they have their own complications and expenses, especially the small mom and pop ones. Like, look at your local minimum income for service industry, by the way, because a lot of people don't even know that in many states it's different. Like Texas, I want to say their minimum wage is still like as low as $7, but I want to say their service industry wage is still $2 or $3 an hour.
Yeah,
Like
tipping
that
culture.
still exists. So yeah, I'm like, it's a problem and I believe it should be addressed. They need to find a way to deal with it, but I don't believe anybody who works should like not be able to afford rent.
Yeah, I mean, it's a proven fact that, a lot of these people that work at, like McDonald's, are also working other jobs as well. They are working a lot, and yet we ridicule them for working at McDonald's like it's somehow a job for high schoolers, even though you expect it to be open on a Sunday at 10 o'clock p.m. to get your Big Mac.
Wait, you want it open? Because remember, McDonald's for breakfast. That was a huge social push. Like McDonald's like didn't offer breakfast for the longest time, right? Like I want to say that was like a whole thing. And like more restaurants have now been pushed because they need to compete with McDonald's. So, yeah, we made it what it is. Where it maybe was an after school job before, it now is not, because the business people want to stop in at 7:45 when they're supposed to be in the office by 8 o'clock with their Mickey D's coffee, like whatever frappuccino fucking thing they offer anymore, and like your sausage patty, which granted, I love that shit, by the way. Like that is like one of those things that I totally will fat kid and break my veganism proudly for and gladly, is a sausage, egg, and cheese McGriddle. But like, but if that's what you want, You should be supporting an income structure that actually supports what you want. And supporting what you want means those people need to be able to afford like living. Because if they can't, and your whole argument is they should get a better job, well then when everybody gets better jobs, who's making your McCheesy? Like,
Exactly.
right? Like it's so stupid, but yet you also don't want robots to take over? Like pick a lane.
Yeah, because there have already been fast food restaurants that have, like in New York, there was this story I saw about this fast food restaurant that actually outsourced their cashiers overseas. But what do I mean by that? They would have like a TV screen, like as at the counter, and someone in like Indonesia or someplace, and I'm just throwing out a country there, but it's someone overseas would be the cashier. They were outsourcing that, and like I guess that's giving someone else overseas a job, and good for them on that point. But it wasn't the best customer experience for people in America here.
Who would
Imagine
have
that.
thought? That whole maybe businesses are starting to slide of not learning from history, right? Because like that, I remember working as a medical biller for the ambulance company, and we know every time we called UHC that if we just asked for an onshore rep, they would transfer us to somebody in America. It's a cultural clash is the thing, is because we were more likely to get an appeal going if we knew we talked to somebody in America than somebody from the India office because of how much more closed fisted it was in those office cultures. I am not speaking of the entire culture. I'm speaking of our office culture experience versus that culture experience. And it was abundantly harder to get things done because it's like our languages weren't actually conforming. Like just because they spoke English, that there was like some cultural thing that I'm sure if we had asked the right way, we could get stuff going. But since nobody would tell us how to ask, it's like how some social services exist for helping you pay for your water and pay for your electric and certain rebates, but you have to ask. They can't offer it to you. I think there was something like that going on, right? So of course, like you're mixing cultures and saying, yeah, they want human interaction. This works, but it doesn't because there's more than just speaking the same language in communication. Like there's a whole thing of just culturally handling customer disputes differently, for example, culturally handling when somebody is billed incorrectly. Like each one learns its different pathway of dealing with a problem. And it was really silly to think like you could just combine those with no training and that it would be smooth. And it sounds like they're experiencing the same thing that we did at a smaller scale at that ambulance company that we were recognizing. And then what's funny is eventually they wouldn't let us do that anymore. Like, and then we had to figure out a whole other way of trying to get a rep or getting anything done. But it's like again, this is like learning from history that they could have maybe seen where the problem was with that. Like, I'd also be interested to see though, because you could use that not across another country, but why not let people work from home then?
You would think.
Right? But we have such a narrative against working from home, even though like none of the data that came out post pandemic when we were basically forced into this idea of working from home. And we got some really cool data from that, if you want to look at it that way. Like the people actually did work better. So what if it kind of almost goes to like you can also spend less money when you're not physically going somewhere. But anyway, I digress too much. But it sounds like that could be a cool concept, but we keep using things the wrong way. And history should have told them that that was going to be a trash can fire.
Well, in closing here, I think what we have to recognize about history is that history isn't about giving you guilt or pride. It's about awareness. It's about not repeating some of the same mistakes that seem to be happening again and again. Learning history doesn't trap you in the past. It gives you options. Like the George W. Bush example when it came to the pandemic, he learned about the past and put things in place to help it so that if we did face a pandemic again, we could make some choices that could save some lives. The goal with history isn't to memorize facts. It's about recognizing that there were humans in the past that made choices that may have been good, that may have been bad, but it's about recognizing, what those choices did that brought us to where we are today and where we could go in the future. And basically, the future belongs to the people who remember the past. It just does. If you don't consider the past in your decision making for anything, you will ultimately fail and make mistakes because, to your point, just because we're living in a society today with high rises and fancy equipment and all that stuff doesn't mean that we are so different from the days of when mail was delivered via the Pony Express. There are a lot of correlations between those times and today that we can learn from.
Yes, and then, my little nerdy neurological psychological closing, I suppose, is recognition that pattern recognition is one of the brain's most efficient functions, but it does require exposure to enough examples to build the pattern. Reading history is literally building neural architecture for recognizing civilizational patterns. And this goes back to building it on the smaller scale in your life is going to help you build it on the bigger scale for really understanding what's going on in our world. This is not a soft skill. It's cognitive infrastructure for navigating a very complex world that is getting more complex with every innovation that comes in. Social media and AI kind of, because I don't think we fully solved AI fully really resolved social media stuff. And here we have AI right back to back with it. So I think it's complicating things. But yeah, so our world's going to get more complex. And people who dismiss historical education as impractical are ironically demonstrating its absence in their life.
Exactly. So learn your history, folks. Yeah, just learn history. It's good. And there's a lot of good history documentaries out there. If you don't want to crack open a book that you can learn from, Ken Burns obviously is a default example for very specific moments in history. But learn from your history. Don't try to get it banned in your school because you think it'll make people feel bad. If it's making people
Yes.
feel bad, that feeling bad thing is actually a good thing because it is inspiring them to change.
Yep. When you go, that feeling, question it. Like,
Exactly.
just question it. It doesn't say that you have to change. Just question.
Indeed. Well, that will wrap up History Month here at Friends Talking Nerdy. Next episode will start our next month of illusions.
Illusion. It's an illusion. Sorry, Arrested Development quote.
I've never watched that show.
Oh my gosh, I actually like that show. It was pretty funny. It's a good one. I might have to catch that on the rewatch and see if that holds. I haven't seen it in a while.
Yeah, yeah. I am watching the season 2 of Ted on Peacock, the prequel show to the. Do you remember the Ted movie with the teddy bear?
Yes. Oh yes. And I
Yeah,
think I've seen
yeah,
Ted too. I want to say I've seen Ted too.
yeah. The sitcom is better than the second movie. The first movie was okay, but yeah, I don't watch much TV myself. A lot more. It's a lot more YouTube stuff, a lot more history stuff, including that the history cooking channel that I showed you because the host reminded me so much of the Mr. Reverend.
Yes, that's right. Well, the Mr. Reverend and I have actually been watching Last Man on Earth, which is really good. It's Will Forte, and it's really kind of hilarious because I just realized last night that it was made and wrapped before the pandemic happened because there's this virus that takes out everybody and you kind of learn about it. And I think we're in season 3 or 4 now, and we kind of see like some people showing their experience of it going down. And it's like, I bet this was an eerie watch for anybody who happened to pick it up in 2020.
Well, we certainly had the time to watch it then. Yeah.
I'm so glad I was exposed to it now and not watching it back in 2020, where a lot of people were picking up old shows that were canceled because they just wanted to watch something that was finished. I'm like, oh man, that would have been a little bit of a mind fudge of like just watching something that was about like, yeah, all of humanity, but like these 5 to 7 people. Like,
Yeah, that does remind me, like right around the pandemic time was when Paramount Plus debuted the new version of Stephen King's The Stand, which is about a virus that takes out the
oh,
world.
oh no, was it a virus? God, I think I just realized I didn't realize if it was a virus that took out the world. It's been a
It
while
was a
since I've
virus.
watched or read The Stand. It's just like The Stand is just like living proof that Rob Lowe might actually be a vampire. I just feel like he looks exactly the same. He's the mute. If people forgot and haven't seen it in a while, like Rob Lowe, he was the mute guy and the older one with the lamest hand of God CGI I think I have ever seen ever. It's early CGI though, so you got to give them some credit.
Yeah, well, and that was 10 years after CGI debuted. The first CGI was in an 80s movie called Young Sherlock Holmes, where it was this. They were like the scene was in a church, and you know how they have those fancy windows in churches, and like a knight like burst out of that window and was made of the stained glass. It was a stained glass knight, and yeah. But anyway, we digress here.
We do a
That's why you
lot.
love us.
That's
Yeah,
yeah,
that's why
we
you love
talk.
us. But
Our conversations sometimes take a journey rather than being direct, which is great because that's pretty much how a conversation with the Reverend Tracy is in person too.
same with Tim the Nerd. Same with Tim the Nerd. But
We're true to ourselves. What can we say?
yes, any other thoughts for our friends at home?
Just be open. Be open and understand and try to have that humility when you learn about something of do you honestly think you would have pushed against what most people do? And when you learn things, may it be about a parent, may it be about even a politician or a friend or whatever, be willing to put it through that filter. Because I think practicing it everywhere you can in your close relationships is going to really help you have a better BS filter on the larger scale where they are actively using social knowledge and psychology to manipulate people. I think it will help prove you for that. So if that can be my real finishing, the Reverend advice, if I don't like to give advice often, but this is just something I feel that strongly about, I think it will make you a genuinely better person to be open to challenging yourselves in the way that I feel like we really did kind of encourage quite a bit today. And it's more important now than ever because of what's going on politically. That be open to challenging yourself, no matter what it is, even if everything about common sense tells you you are right. Challenge it because that's going to be the thing that's going to keep you true along the lines. And don't be afraid to share where you've changed your minds. I've shared very openly some of the horrifically racist and even homophobic stuff from my raising in Texas. And I think it is super important to give examples that you can change and come out the other side not half burnt to death.
Because Siths don't deal in absolutes.
Yes, the Siths don't deal in absolutes, and everybody in human history is human.
Damn right. Well, with that, each Monday we'll have something in this podcast space to entertain your ear holes. Until we meet again, we bid you adieu.
The future belongs to those who prepare for it today. That's Malcolm X. I'm not going to try to take credit for that.
All right. I would have. Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy
on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye, friend.